At 2:13 in the morning, my husband's phone lit up against the marble nightstand beside me, and before I could even process the name on the screen, a woman answered his incoming call from his own phone with a sleepy laugh and said, "He's in the shower, should I tell him you called back?" I remember staring at the dark ceiling of our bedroom in Chicago while my husband slept beside me, breathing slowly like nothing in the world could possibly touch him, and realizing the woman he'd spent 11 months calling just staff knew exactly how he took his coffee because I heard her ask someone in the background if he still wanted oat milk before his meeting. I didn't scream. I didn't wake him up. I didn't ask questions he would lie about anyway. Instead, I slid quietly out of bed, opened my laptop at the kitchen island, and booked the first flight to San Francisco, leaving that morning because his calendar had one detail he forgot to hide from me: a 4-day leadership conference at the Fairmont that his company had never actually scheduled. By sunrise, I already knew two things for certain. My husband was cheating on me, and he had absolutely no idea who he was married to. I was 29 years old when I learned that betrayal rarely begins with lipstick stains or dramatic confessions. It begins with small corrections in someone's behavior that only the person who truly loves them notices first. Ethan stopped leaving his laptop open near me around February. By April, he started turning his phone face down during dinner. In June, he claimed his company hired a new operations coordinator named Vanessa who was intense but efficient, and somehow her name started appearing in almost every story he told about work without him realizing it. Vanessa handled the client dinner. Vanessa booked the flights. Vanessa stayed late to help finish projections. Always Vanessa. Always just staff. Meanwhile, I was the woman reminding him about his mother's cardiology appointment, mailing anniversary gifts to his clients' wives, and quietly managing the consulting firm I built remotely after leaving corporate finance 2 years earlier to support his career expansion. The humiliating part wasn't even the affair. It was the confidence. Ethan genuinely believed I was too emotionally dependent on him to ever question anything. 3 days before that 2:13 a.m. phone call, he kissed my forehead in our kitchen and said, "I'm lucky you trust me this much." I remember smiling softly and thinking, you should be careful with that assumption. By 6:40 that morning, I was sitting in business class with my phone on airplane mode and a legal pad open across my lap, writing down every detail I could remember from the past year because calm people survive betrayal differently than emotional people do. We document first, react later. Ethan woke up after I'd already boarded and sent me a text at 7:12 a.m. that said, "Morning beautiful. Don't forget dinner with the Millers tonight." I stared at the message for a long moment before replying, "Wouldn't miss it." Then I muted the conversation entirely. During the 4-hour flight to San Francisco, I logged into the shared Amex account Ethan assumed I never reviewed because I hated numbers after leaving finance, which had always been amusing considering numbers were exactly how I became financially independent before 30. The charges told a cleaner story than he ever could. Hotel bar tabs for 2. Car service upgrades. A jewelry purchase from Bellevue totaling $4,870 3 weeks after he told me his bonus had been delayed. Then I found the detail that actually made me smile. Recurring payments for a luxury apartment in Seattle under an LLC Ethan created 8 months earlier called Alder Ridge Holdings. He'd hidden the property well enough from most spouses. Unfortunately for him, the LLC registration listed me as the secondary guarantor because he'd used our joint financial statements during approval. Around noon, my car pulled up outside the Fairmont San Francisco, where Ethan had supposedly been attending executive meetings all weekend. I checked in under my maiden name, Claire Bennett, and asked the concierge one simple question. "Could you tell me if the Horizon Summit conference is using the ballroom level this week?" The concierge blinked politely before saying, "I'm sorry, ma'am, we don't have an event by that name scheduled." I thanked him, tipped him $50, and took the elevator to the 8th floor without another word. Ethan's room number had already been sitting in my inbox for hours because he still forwarded all company travel confirmations to our shared email account out of habit. Room 814. Mine was 810. 4 doors away. At 2:47 p.m., I heard them before I saw them. Ethan's laugh carried through the hallway first, relaxed and careless in a way I hadn't heard in months, followed by a woman's voice saying, "You really think she still believes these conferences exist?" I remained inside my room with the door cracks slightly open as they walked past. Vanessa was younger than I expected, maybe 24, wearing one of Ethan's navy cashmere sweaters with her hair still damp from the shower. Ethan kissed the side of her head while unlocking the suite door and said quietly, "Claire trusts me with everything." The silence that followed inside my chest felt almost peaceful. Not because it didn't hurt, because certainty is cleaner than suspicion. I waited exactly 18 minutes before walking downstairs to the lobby cafe, where I ordered tea and opened my laptop beside the window facing the elevators. At 3:26 p.m., Vanessa came down alone wearing oversized sunglasses and carrying Ethan's corporate laptop bag. She looked nervous now, distracted, checking her phone repeatedly while typing emails from a corner table. Then my own phone buzzed. "Ethan. Meeting's running late. Might have to stay an extra night." I took a slow sip of tea before responding, "Of course. Handle what you need to." 3 minutes later, another message appeared. "You're honestly the easiest person in the world to be married to." I looked up just as Vanessa laughed softly at something on her screen 20 feet away from me, completely unaware that the woman funding half the life she was enjoying was sitting close enough to hear her breathe. That was the exact moment I stopped thinking about whether my marriage could survive this. Instead, I started thinking about what Ethan had exposed himself to financially, legally, and professionally by underestimating me this badly. At 6:15 that evening, Ethan and Vanessa left the hotel together dressed for dinner, and I followed them 3 car lengths behind through Nob Hill traffic in a black rental Mercedes he would never recognize because Ethan never noticed details unless they benefited him directly. They ended up at a private restaurant inside Jackson Square called Bix, the kind of dimly lit place executives use when they want discretion disguised as sophistication. I sat at the bar near the piano with my hair pinned differently, my glasses on, and a silk trench coat Ethan had never seen because I'd bought it during a client trip to Milan 2 years earlier. Men like Ethan only see the version of their wives that serves their routines. They rarely notice who she becomes outside of them. From my seat, I watched Vanessa slide her hand across the white tablecloth toward him while he smiled in the exact careful way he used to smile at me during our first year of marriage. Then I heard something far more valuable than an apology would have been. Ethan leaned back in his chair and said quietly, "Once the Seattle expansion closes, the divorce will be simple. Claire's emotionally attached to stability. She'll negotiate, not fight." Vanessa laughed under her breath. "You make her sound predictable." Ethan took a sip of wine before answering, "That's because she is." I remember looking down at my untouched martini and feeling something inside me settle permanently into place. Not heartbreak. Clarity. Because Ethan wasn't just cheating. He had already built an entire future around the assumption that I would remain soft, trusting, and manageable, while he repositioned assets behind my back. What he still didn't understand was that I had quietly retained ownership percentages in 2 consulting partnerships he believed I'd dissolved after marriage, and one of those firms had recently signed a federal compliance contract worth more than Ethan's annual compensation package. At 8:42 p.m., while they were ordering dessert, my phone rang with a number from Seattle. It was Daniel Mercer, one of my attorneys, calling to confirm whether I wanted him to proceed with the financial review I'd requested that afternoon. I stepped outside beneath the restaurant awning before answering. "Do it," I told him calmly. "I want full exposure on every joint liability connected to Alder Ridge Holdings before Monday morning." Daniel paused briefly before saying, "Claire, there's something else. The apartment isn't the only property." My grip tightened slightly around the phone. "What else is there?" Papers shuffled on his end. "There's a second purchase under the same LLC. A waterfront property in Bellevue. Estimated value, $3.8 million. For 3 seconds, all I could hear was rain hitting the sidewalk beside me. Ethan had told me 6 months earlier that we needed to delay trying for children because cash flow was tighter than expected. Meanwhile, he'd been building a hidden real estate portfolio for another woman using leveraged marital assets partially tied to my business income. "Freeze everything you legally can tonight," I said quietly. "And Daniel." "Yes. I want copies sent directly to me before he knows we're looking." When I returned inside, Ethan was standing near the hostess station with Vanessa's coat draped over his arm, smiling down at her like a man completely convinced his future was secured. Then his eyes lifted casually across the room and landed directly on me. The change in his expression happened instantly. Confusion first. then disbelief, then something colder. Fear. I held his stare for exactly 2 seconds before turning calmly back toward the bartender and signing my receipt without acknowledging him at all. Behind me I heard Vanessa whisper sharply, "Ethan, who is that?" And for the first time in our entire marriage, my husband sounded uncertain when he answered. "That," he said quietly, "is my wife." I left the restaurant before Ethan could reach me, not because I was afraid of the confrontation, but because timing matters when someone has spent months constructing lies. Shock makes people reckless. Reckless people expose themselves. By the time Ethan caught up to me outside on Gold Street, rain was sliding down the shoulders of my trench coat in thin silver lines while black cars moved slowly through the intersection behind us. "Claire," he said sharply, grabbing my elbow just enough to stop me walking away. "What are you doing here?" I looked down at his hand first, then back up at him. That's an interesting question coming from someone attending a conference that doesn't exist. He released my arm immediately. For a second he actually looked embarrassed, which almost made this easier. Almost. "It's not what you think," he started, lowering his voice as pedestrians passed us. "Vanessa and I. You moved company money through a private LLC tied to our joint financial disclosures," I interrupted calmly. "You purchased 2 properties without notifying your spouse while preparing for divorce negotiations I was apparently never supposed to see coming." His face drained of color so quickly it felt almost cinematic. "How do you know about Alder Ridge?" That question told me everything. Not "I'm sorry." Not "can we talk?" Just panic over the finances. "Because unlike you," I said quietly, "I actually read documents before signing them." He glanced back nervously toward the restaurant windows where Vanessa was still standing frozen near the entrance. "Claire, listen to me carefully. None of this is finalized yet." I nearly smiled. "You're right. It isn't." Then I handed him a folded envelope from my handbag and walked away before he could open it. Inside were copies of the LLC filings, the Bellevue property records, and a notice from Daniel Mercer requesting immediate preservation of all financial communications related to marital assets. At 11:08 p.m., Ethan started calling. By midnight, he had called 17 times. I ignored everyone. Instead, I sat inside my hotel suite with room service untouched beside me, while Daniel walked me through the bigger issue over speakerphone. "Claire, there's exposure here beyond the affair," he explained carefully. "The Seattle property appears connected to a vendor relationship involving Ethan's company expansion project." I leaned forward slowly. "Explain that." "Vanessa's brother owns part of the contracting group selected for the Bellevue development." Silence filled the room for a long moment. Then Daniel added quietly, "If Ethan approved any internal recommendations without disclosure, this becomes corporate ethics territory very quickly." Suddenly, the hidden apartments in cheating looked much smaller. Ethan wasn't just betraying his marriage. He might have compromised his executive position for the woman he was sleeping with. At 7:30 the next morning, my phone buzzed with a company-wide email Ethan accidentally copied me on, because my address remained attached to several executive hospitality lists. Subject line: Emergency Leadership Review, Mandatory Attendance. I stared at the screen for several seconds before another message arrived directly from Ethan. "Please don't do this publicly." That one sentence irritated me more than the affair itself. Public embarrassment was finally what scared him. Not lying. Not stealing. Not humiliating me for months while planning a future with someone else. I typed back only 6 words. "I haven't done anything yet, Ethan." 23 minutes later, someone knocked on my hotel door. It wasn't Ethan. It was Vanessa. She stood there pale-faced in yesterday's cream-colored coat, mascara smudged beneath exhausted eyes that made her suddenly look much younger than 24. "I didn't know," she said immediately before I could speak. "About the properties. About the accounts. He told me you were already separated emotionally." I studied her quietly for a moment before stepping aside to let her enter. Vanessa looked around the suite nervously, and then whispered something that changed everything. "There's something else you need to know before the board meeting today." I closed the door behind her softly. "Then start talking." Vanessa sat stiffly at the edge of the sofa, twisting the sleeve of her coat between her fingers while San Francisco fog pressed against the suite windows behind her. And for the first time since this started, I realized she was scared of Ethan too. 3 weeks ago, she said quietly, he asked me to delete internal emails connected to the Bellevue project. I stayed standing near the minibar, listening without interrupting. At first I thought it was normal cleanup because the acquisition was confidential, but then he started moving invoices off the corporate system and paying certain contractors privately. She swallowed hard before adding, when I questioned it, he told me executives do this all the time. I crossed my arms slowly. And you believed him? Vanessa looked down. I wanted to. That answer was honest enough to matter. She reached into her bag and pulled out a silver flash drive. I copied everything before deleting the files. My eyes settled on the drive resting in her palm. Why bring this to me? She laughed once without humor. Because at dinner last night I realized something. What? He talks about people like their investments, including me. The room fell quiet after that. At 10:40 a.m., I walked into the executive conference floor of Fairmont, San Francisco, wearing a charcoal silk suit Ethan once told me looked too intimidating for client meetings. The leadership review had already started by the time I arrived. Through the glass walls I could see Ethan seated beside legal counsel at the far end of the table, jaw tight, phone face down, exhaustion carved visibly into his expression. The moment he noticed me entering the corridor, he stood abruptly. Claire, he said under his breath as he stepped outside the room, please, don't walk in there. I looked at him calmly. Why? Afraid they'll see the real version of you. His voice lowered further. You don't understand how catastrophic this could become. Actually, I replied softly, I understand perfectly. Then I handed him another envelope. Inside was a draft divorce filing, temporary financial restraint orders, and copies of the vendor communications Vanessa had preserved. Ethan flipped through the pages quickly before going completely still at the final document. You involved forensic accountants? He whispered. Yesterday morning, I said. For a long moment, he just stared at me like a man suddenly realizing the floor beneath him had already collapsed hours earlier. Claire, we can fix this privately. I almost felt sorry for him then because he still believed the problem was exposure instead of character. Behind the glass wall, 2 board members were already watching us. One of them opened the conference room door and asked carefully, Mr. Mercer, is there an issue? Ethan didn't answer immediately. I did. I believe your company counsel may want to review conflicts tied to the Bellevue expansion before proceeding today. The silence that followed inside that hallway felt enormous. By 4:15 p.m., Ethan had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Vanessa resigned voluntarily with legal representation present. And I was sitting alone beside the tall windows of the airport lounge waiting for my flight back to Chicago when Ethan finally approached me one last time. He looked older now, smaller somehow. Was any of it real? He asked quietly. Us, I mean. I closed my laptop slowly before answering. I loved you enough to trust you completely, I said. That was real. He nodded once, eyes red from lack of sleep. And now? I glanced out toward the runway lights glowing against the evening fog. Now you get to live with the version of yourself you worked so hard to hide. Boarding was called 2 minutes later. I stood, picked up my coat, and walked past him without looking back while he remained there alone beside the window, finally understanding something far too late. Silence becomes dangerous when the woman you underestimated has already finished planning her exit. The divorce finalized 8 months later on a gray Thursday morning, while Chicago was buried under the first snow of December, and by then Ethan's investigation had already expanded far beyond the Bellevue contracts. His company settled quietly to avoid public litigation. 3 executives resigned within the same quarter, and the man who once told his assistant I was predictable ended up moving into a furnished apartment 20 minutes outside the city because most of his assets were frozen during the financial review. Meanwhile, I reopened my private consulting firm under my maiden name and signed 2 corporate partnerships before my 30th birthday. The strange part is that people assume revenge feels loud or triumphant when it finally arrives, but it doesn't. Real power is much quieter than that. It's sitting across from someone who underestimated your intelligence for years and realizing you no longer need them to understand your value. Last month, Ethan sent one final email that simply said, I never realized how much you were holding together. I read it once, archived it, and went back to work. Because some endings don't need closure. They just need distance. If you've ever stayed silent while someone mistook your kindness for weakness, subscribe. Because the calmest person in the room is usually the one people should fear the most.